Rain slicked the Brooklyn street, neon flicker from Sal's deli painting the puddles in cold blue. Marco Russo, 38, broad-shouldered with a sharp jaw and slicked-back black hair, slammed the Buick door as thunder rolled above. His boots splashed through shallow streams, heart pounding with the smell of iron in the air. "Eddie, don't you walk away from me," he called, voice cutting through the drizzle. Eddie stopped, turned just enough for Marco to see fear dancing behind defiance. A gunshot cracked, startling the pigeons from the eaves. Eddie's body crumpled, red blooming across his chest, pooling into the gutter. Marco's knees hit the asphalt, hands trembling as they clutched the small silver crucifix from Eddie's neck. A scream tore from a window above, blending with the distant hum of traffic. The neon flicker faltered, and Marco's breath came in ragged bursts, each exhale a mist in the cold night. He stared at the crucifix, rain dripping from his lashes, knowing the street had just claimed another soul, and maybe part of his own. The funeral smelled of lilies and damp wool, a place where grief dressed itself in black suits and forced smiles. Marco stood by the coffin, watching Eddie's mother clutch a rosary so tight her knuckles whitened. The boss, Vincent Marino, 55, slick gray hair and a politician's smile, gave a eulogy that dripped with false warmth. Marco's gut churned at every word. "A loyal son of the neighborhood," Vincent said, his voice carrying the weight of finality. Mourners whispered, hands shook, hugs felt like business transactions. Then, during the slow shuffle toward the exit, Vincent's grip on Marco's hand tightened. Folded note slid into his palm, no eye contact, just a faint smile. Marco didn't read it until he was alone in the rain-smeared parking lot. In neat handwriting, "Meet me at the club. Midnight.e." His pulse quickened, though not from anticipation. This wasn't an invitation. It was a summons. The club was alive with saxophone wails and cigarette haze. Red velvet drapes hung heavy, swallowing the dim golden light. Marco moved through the crowd, ignoring nods from men who owed him favors and debts alike. In the corner booth, Vincent sat with a glass of scotch, fingers drumming a slow rhythm on the table. "Sit," Vincent said, not looking up from his drink. Marco slid into the booth, the leather cold against his back. "Eddie was family," Vincent murmured, his voice a dangerous lull. "Family doesn't ask questions, you understand?" Marco's jaw tightened, but he nodded. The music swelled, a trumpet bleeding into the smoke-thick air. Vincent leaned forward, eyes sharp now. "Good. There's work to be done." The rain had eased by the time Marco stepped out of the club, but the city's chill lingered. He lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating the hollows of his face. Across the street, a shadow leaned against a lamppost. Detective Harris, mid-40s, trench coat as worn as his eyes. "Long night?" Harris asked, voice low, smile crooked. "Some nights never end," Marco replied, exhaling smoke into the damp air. Harris stepped closer, shoes splashing in a shallow puddle. "Watch yourself. Vincent's not the forgiving type, and neither am I." Then he was gone, melting into the alley fog. Marco stood there, the cigarette burning down to ash, wondering which threat would find him first. Marco's apartment smelled faintly of coffee and gun oil. He sat at the small kitchen table, the note from Vincent spread open beside his half-empty cup. The crucifix lay in front of him, its chains still tangled. Outside, sirens wailed faintly, the city never sleeping. He thought about Eddie, the jokes, the late-night walks, the shared scars. The weight in Marco's chest wasn't just grief, it was suspicion thick and unshakable. Somewhere between the folds of that note and the glint of the crucifix was the truth, and Marco intended to drag it into the light, no matter how deep he had to dig, or how many graves he had to pass. Midnight at the club felt colder than the street, as if the music had learned to shiver. Marco slid into the shadowed booth, the leather sticking to his coat like a warning. Vincent Marino smiled, but his eyes measured debts. "You came," Vincent said, raising a glass that caught the gold light like a lure. Marco said, "You summoned." The band let a saxophone cry that sounded like a confession. Vincent leaned in, voice velvet over wire. We keep order by keeping stories short. Marco felt the crucifix in his pocket pulse like a second heartbeat. Eddie's story ended too fast, he said, steady as a metronome. Vincent's fingers drummed, a soft threat in 4/4 time. Then keep your curiosity shorter. Silence stretched thick with smoke and memory. Marco said, give me the name who pulled the trigger. Vincent's smile cooled. Names are for gravestones, kid. The glass landed soft, but the message hit hard. Marco stood, the booth releasing him like a bruise, and decided the truth would not come dressed in silk. By dawn the docks coughed fog and diesel, and the gulls wrote curses across the sky. Marco walked the planks where he used to scrap for pocket change and pride. A stevedore with a crooked cap nodded without warmth. Sorry about Eddie, the man said, eyes dodging like minnows. Marco said, I'm not collecting sympathy. He slipped a bill and a look that meant respect. The man sighed. There's been talk of a new route, quiet crates, no customs. Marco felt the tide tug at the past. Heroin moves well when the sea is rough, he said, almost to himself. Chains rattled as a crane moaned into motion. I ponder, whoa. Ask around Pier 9, the man whispered. But ask like a stranger. Marco turned toward the warehouses, their corrugated ribs catching the first pale light. He thought of Eddie's laugh breaking over the water when they were boys. I'll ask like I never lived here, he said, and the fog swallowed his footsteps. The diner off Kent smelled like burnt sugar and old secrets. Lina Morales sat in a corner booth, 36, Puerto Rican-American, sharp eyes softened by the steam rising from her coffee. Marco slid in across from her and kept his hands on the formica. You still pray over your food, he said, noticing her fingers brush a tiny medal. Lina smiled without giving it away. I pray over people, she said. He let the line sit. Eddie trusted you, he said, and the room narrowed. She looked at the window where the city fogged its own reflection. He didn't know when to keep quiet, she said, voice gentle as a warning. They're moving things through Pier 9 with new faces and old lies. Marco felt the coffee turn bitter in his mouth. Who signs the paper? She folded a napkin into an arrow. Names are written on favors, she said. But one favor belongs to Vincent. The arrow pointed nowhere, which was everywhere. Careful, Marco, she whispered. Truth breaks the loyal first. Detective Harris waited outside the diner like a bad dream that learned to smoke. He flicked ash, then a grin. You keep interesting company, he said. Marco kept the crucifix thumbed like a worry stone. You follow me or her? Harris shrugged. Both taste the same in reports. He moved closer, coat whispering like paper. I can make Pier 9 talk, he said. But my kind of sermon needs an offering. Marco kept his face polite and unhelpful. You'll get scripture when I get a miracle. Harris chuckled, but his eyes stayed hungry. Miracles are for the clean, he said. You and me live on discounts. He slipped a card into Marco's pocket with the ease of a pickpocket blessing. Midnight, South Street lot, he murmured. Bring ears, not fists. Marco watched him go and wondered which side of the badge the truth preferred. The gulls screamed agreement with no one. Pier 9 slept with one eye open, and Marco learned where it focused. He circled the chain-link perimeter, while trucks murmured behind the warehouse walls. A camera blinked red like a tiny heartbeat. You don't belong here tonight, a voice said from the dark. Marco didn't turn. Neither do funerals, he answered. The watcher stepped into a sliver of light, a kid barely 20 with nerves wired to a radio. They're moving foreign freight under union labels, the kid muttered. If you're smart, you're deaf. Marco said, I was loyal before I could spell it. The kid glanced at the camera and looked older. Loyal gets sold by the pound, he said. Tires squealed somewhere deeper in the grid, and doors rumbled like a throat clearing. Marco slipped him a number and a look that meant later. You never saw me, he said. The kid nodded, which meant maybe. The tide slapped the pilings like a clock hand, and Marco counted down to midnight. Midnight bled into the South Street lot where cars idled like patient wolves. Marco counted the lamps, the exits, and the lies he could afford. Detective Harris leaned on a rusted rail and wore a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "You brought ears," Harris said, tapping his own like a salesman of bad ideas. Marco said, "I left the fists at confession." A freighter horn moaned across the river, dragging old promises with it. Harris opened a folder that smelled like mildew and payroll. "Pier 9 manifests," he said, "with saints' names and sinner signatures." Marco saw Vincent's front company stamped like a blessing. "Paper is cheap," Marco said, though his pulse climbed the stairs. Harris flicked ash, then needled the price. "I want a ledger from the club office," he said. "You get proof, I get a future." Marco felt the crucifix press his palm like a witness. "I'll take the sermon," he said, "but I don't kneel." Sirens wailed far off, as if the city had heard every word and taken notes. The club slept with the lights on, which meant someone feared the dark. Marco slipped through the back, past crates that smelled like citrus and gun oil. The office door wore a new lock, proud and obvious. He listened to the hallway breathe, then bent the code with a practiced hand. Drawers coughed receipts, bribes, and sentiment. A ledger hid under a framed photo of a ribbon cutting, Vincent's smile the color of winter. Marco flipped pages of neat crimes and immaculate arithmetic. There it was, a string of deliveries baptized with saints and anchored to Pier 9. "You always wanted tidy," Marco muttered, pocketing the proof. The floor creaked, then a whisper of leather. A goon stepped in with a pistol that believed in simple endings. "Mr. Marino says curiosity kills careers," the man said. Marco lowered his shoulder, heard the gun bark, and tasted plaster dust. He left the office poorer in blood and richer in answers. He patched his shoulder with whiskey and tape in a bathroom, the size of a prayer. The mirror offered a face that remembered better stories. Lena knocked once like a friend and twice like a warning. "Ah, you look like the truth found you first," she said, closing the door on the city noise. Marco set the ledger on the sink, where the light could judge it. "Vincent launders faith through Pier 9, he said. And Eddie got in the way of the collection plate." Lena traced a line on the page that spelled danger in clean ink. "This isn't discipline," she said. "It's insurance." He felt the room tilt as the pain clock struck. "Harris wants this to buy himself a pension," Marco said. "I want it to buy justice." Lena's eyes softened until they didn't. "Justice is a currency with counterfeiters," she said. She pressed gauze into his shoulder and whispered, "Don't bleed for men who sell your loyalty retail." The docks returned at dawn with a hangover of fog and secrets. Marco walked Pier 9, like a man visiting an old crime scene built from childhood. Forklifts coughed, gulls complained, and clipboards pretended to be law. He spotted the kid look out from before, nerves stitched to a radio. "You still deaf?" Marco asked, eyes on the cameras. The kid swallowed his yes. "Containers marked with saints get waved through," he muttered. "Customs sees what it's told." A foreman barked, and the kid flinched into invisibility. Marco followed the sainted numbers to a stack that smelled like money and bleach. He photographed seals and stamped codes, pockets heavier with dangerous clarity. A black sedan idled where cameras died. A window lowered to reveal a stranger with a smile borrowed from a knife store. "Mr. Marino appreciates loyalty," the man said. "He wants to keep yours where he can see it." Marco said he already lost it, and the window rose like a curtain. Harris spread the ledger on a diner table and ordered coffee, strong enough to arrest a heart. "This buys me daylight," he said, eyes jumping between lines like a thief. Marco kept one hand on the crucifix, and the other on patience. "It buys Eddie the courtesy of being more than a footnote," he said. Harris smirked, then sobered. "Vincent won't let a book end him," he said. Hell burned the library. Rain began to tap the windows like an impatient drummer. Lena slid into the booth with a look that dared the storm to get louder. "You both missed something," she said, tapping a column of dates that lined up like a firing squad. "Tomorrow night, the biggest shipment yet." Marco felt the city lean toward a decision. "We pull it into the light," he said. Harris nodded, but his smile stayed crooked. "Light draws moths," he said. "And pyres," Marco said. "Then we bring water," and the rain obliged. Night pressed low over Pier 9, a lid holding in steam and rumor. Marco watched the river carry secrets toward the Atlantic like it had a schedule to keep. Lena leaned against a crate marked with a saint's name and a sinner's price. "You sure about trusting Harris?" she asked, breath fogging into a brief ghost. Marco said, "I trust deadlines and leverage." Forklifts dozed with their forks lifted like tired fists. A tug's horn rolled across the water and made the lights tremble in the puddles. "Vincent thinks loyalty is a leash," Marco said, fingers working the crucifix chain like a code. Lena studied him the way medics study bleeding. "Leashes can be cut," she murmured. Marco nodded, but the gesture felt heavier than a cent. "We flip the shipment," he said. "We show the city the math." She looked past him at the stacked metal, each box a promise with a lie inside. "Truth is not a crowd pleaser," she said. "It's a crowd divider." Marco smiled without humor. "Then let the crowd choose," he answered, and the river chose silence. They took shelter in a warehouse office that smelled of rope and histories. Lena closed the blinds like closing eyes on a body. "I owe you the worst truth," she said, voice steady as a fuse. Marco felt the room tilt before the words even walked in. "Vincent ordered Eddie," she said, and the sentence sat on the desk like a weapon. He did not speak until his hands stopped shaking. "Discipline?" he asked, though he knew. "Cover," she replied, pointing to ledger dates that lined up with tides. Eddie heard about the route and thought confession bought absolution. Marco saw Eddie's grin in the dark and wanted to punch a calendar. "Who pulled the trigger?" he asked, but the name did not matter because the order had already killed the world. Lena touched his knuckles and did not offer comfort. "You never left the family," she said. "The family left you." He nodded once, and the crucifix lay between their hands like a verdict waiting for a hammer. The church on Union was unlocked because forgiveness kept long hours. Marco lit a candle and tested its silence. Vincent stepped from a side aisle with a smile that knew too many funerals. "You came to pray or to bargain?" Vincent asked, voice soft as old wood. "Both," Marco said, eyes on the altar where saints watched with chipped patience. Vincent stood beside him, and the candlelight carved new lies in his face. "You were my best shepherd," Vincent said. "You kept wolves and men in their lanes." Marco said, "Some wolves wear better suits." He let the crucifix swing and felt the weight change. "Eddie didn't deserve a street gutter," he said, and the sentence refused to echo. Vincent's hand landed on his shoulder like a benediction that burned. "Loyalty is expensive," Vincent murmured. "Sometimes it is paid in advance." Marco stared at the flame and heard the confession that wasn't. "I will collect the interest," he said, and the candle guttered as if it agreed. Harris chose an empty parking garage where tire screams had retired to memory. He leaned on a pillar and spun a key like a lazy threat. "Your book sings," he said, nodding at the ledger. "But I need a choir." Marco watched the ramp, throat the night air. "You want tapes," he said. "You want voices that bleed admissible." Harris shrugged a confession into his coat. "I want Vincent with no exits." He handed over a bug so small, it felt like guilt. "Plant it in his office, and we both wake up taller." Marco weighed the device, and heard the click of a trap that could belong to anyone. "If this goes sideways," he said, "you won't see me fall." Harris grinned the way gamblers pray. "I never watch falls," he said. "I watch landings." A car turned on somewhere below like a rumor starting. Marco slid the bug into a pocket that had carried worse. The club's back hallway felt like a throat swallowing. Marco moved with a memory's confidence and a stranger's caution. He entered the office that had already tried to kill him and let the door sigh shut. The bug clicked into the underside of Vincent's desk like a secret discovering its home. He opened a drawer and found a photo of boys on a dock, one of them Eddie, all sunlight and ignorance. "I will not let you be a receipt," Marco said, placing the picture face up. Footsteps approached, slow and convinced. He killed the lamp and slid into the curtain's shadow with breath held short. Vincent entered with two capos, talking about tides and schedules. "Family eats first," Vincent said, and the desk recorded him without appetite. Marco pictured Dawn washing the warehouse and telling the city a new story. He slipped out as the voices turned to laughter that didn't live long. The night exhaled, and the crucifix lay cold against his heart like a promise sharpening. Morning broke like a cheap alibi, thin and already fraying. Marco spread photographs across his kitchen table, each one a breadcrumb toward the pier. The bug's recordings hissed from a small speaker. Vincent's voice counting tides and debts. "Family eats first," the recording said, and the words tasted like ash. Lena leaned on the doorframe, eyes scanning the paper map he had carved with notes. "We go public today," she said, but her tone weighed every consequence. Marco said, "We go careful, not loud." He traced a route from Pier 9 to a safe garage where Harris would stage the seizure. "Vincent will smell this," Lena warned. Marco nodded, feeling the crucifix bite his palm. "Then, let him smell smoke and not fire." She stepped closer and lowered his hand from the weapon drawer. "You are not a bullet," she said. "You are a blade." Outside, sirens gossiped about trouble that had not happened yet. Marco gathered the evidence and decided which lies to let live, until dark. The plan wore modest clothes and tried to look ordinary. Harris arranged unmarked vans to idle near Pier 9 like forgotten appliances. He met Marco in an alley where daylight went to smoke. "Your tape is enough for a judge with a conscience," Harris said. "I only need one with a calendar." Marco handed over copies and kept the originals like a superstition. "We take the shipment before midnight," he said. "We show the numbers, then we show the names." Harris smiled, the way a door smiles before it shuts. "I will be there, kid," he said. "But if bullets start spelling my name, I skip the spelling bee." Marco said, "You get your ledger ending. I get Eddie a sentence that fits." The detective flicked away a cigarette that had stopped pretending to help. "Bring your blade," he said. "Leave your funeral voice at home." The alley exhaled diesel and rain, and the deal felt more like a dare. Vincent hosted a luncheon that smelled like money pretending to be marinara. Politicians laughed as if applause paid rent. Marco entered through the kitchen with a delivery jacket and a face that had forgotten fear. He slipped into the corridor outside Vincent's private dining room, the bug in his pocket recording hunger. A capo blocked the door with a look that misread him as furniture. "Delivery for the big table," Marco said, holding a covered tray that carried nothing but nerve. Inside, Vincent lifted a glass and offered a prayer to commerce. Marco slid the tray near a sideboard and bent like a servant. "Mr. Marino," he said softly, and the room tilted toward the whisper. Vincent turned, eyes sharpening like a whetstone. "Do I know you?" he asked. Marco smiled with no teeth. "You know my loyalty," he said. The tray lid clanged shut, and the bug drank confessions dressed as toasts. He left with a nod that said goodbye to mercy. By dusk the river turned iron, and trucks lined like beads on a stolen rosary. Marco and Lena parked 2 blocks off, the engine ticking down its worries. "If Harris ghosts us, we still cut the line," Lena said, chambering resolve into her voice. Marco checked his phone, and the copied files like a gambler counting clean chips. "He shows," he said. "Because men like Harris worship momentum." They moved along a fence where shadows did arithmetic with floodlights. A forklift shrieked, and the gate rolled, revealing containers with saint names that now felt like jokes. "Blessed are the bribed," Lena said low and bitter. They slipped through a service door and climbed a catwalk that gave them math and vantage. Below, men stacked authority into neat stacks. Marco filmed faces, seals, and schedules. He whispered, "Eddie, keep me honest," and for a second the river went quiet in respect. Headlights carved the fog, and unmarked vans rolled into place like punctuation. Harris emerged with agents who looked allergic to hesitation. "This is your choir," he said, eyes counting bodies and exits. The foreman shouted orders that sounded like prayers breaking. Men scattered, some toward doors, some toward guns, and the night learned 3 new languages. Marco moved with Lena down the catwalk stairs, heart drumming a tempo that could start a war or end a lie. "Seize that row," Harris barked, and forklifts froze as if baptized. Vincent's black sedan slid into the yard with the discretion of a blade. He stepped out calm, hands clean, smile already drafting an alibi. "You are interrupting dinner," Vincent said, velvet over iron. Marco said, "I prefer late courses." The first siren wailed close, promising an audience. The river inhaled, and the city leaned forward to watch someone choose what loyalty meant. Sirens stitched the fog into a net, but the fish learned new routes. Forklifts froze while agents pried seals like stubborn prayers. Detective Harris barked orders that sounded rehearsed and tired. Vincent Marino stood beside his black sedan, chin high, hands clean of consequence. "Proceed," Vincent said, smiling at a camera that wasn't his. Marco Russo felt the crucifix cut his palm like a contract he hadn't signed. Lena Morales watched the yard's geometry and found the missing angles. "They're light," she said, voice tight. "These containers are decoys." Harris cursed, then smiled too fast to be honest. "Keep opening," Harris said, which meant stall. Marco said, "Where's the real cargo, Vincent?" Vincent's eyes warmed like a winter bulb. "At church," he said, and the word tasted like chlorine. A crane groaned, and the fog performed a disappearance trick with 3 trucks. Marco ran heart loud, loyalty louder, and the night moved its pieces without asking permission. The trucks punched through a service gate that swung like a drunk door. Marco vaulted a low barrier and landed in a puddle that smelled like rust and motive. Lena kept pace, breath even, eyes hunting for patterns that lied less. "South ramp," she said, reading tire spray like scripture. Harris shouted into his radio with urgency that arrived late. "Unit 3, cut them off," he said, but his feet did not move toward the fight. Vincent adjusted his cuff and admired the choreography he bought. "You always did run well, kid," Vincent said, voice soft as a blessing. Marco said, "I learned chasing ghosts you left behind." The first truck fish-tailed and regained faith, taillights calling sinners home. A gate arm shattered, and alarms climbed a ladder of pitch. Lena said, "We split," and Marco nodded because trust had homework. The yard shrank in the rearview of events, and the city opened like a wound. They hunted the first truck through streets that remembered dock workers and bad outcomes. Marco drove a borrowed sedan that rattled like a conscience. Lena traced routes on her phone with fingers that didn't tremble. "Warehouse grid by the viaduct," she said. "Short-term, cold storage." Marco said, "Heroin sleeps better on ice." Headlights tore at the rain and turned it into falling wire. The truck swerved into an underpass where cameras blinked out like ashamed witnesses. "We need proof, not just a chase," Lena said, keeping her voice inside the lane. Marco tightened on the wheel until the leather confessed. "We take a crate," he said. "We take the night back." A van cut in and forced them wide, and a second truck joined like a chorus. Lena said, "They're shepherding us," and the word felt old and cruel. Marco exhaled, then smiled. "Then we bite the shepherd," he said, and the engine agreed. The viaduct lot appeared like a rumor with a security camera problem. Marco killed the lights and let the sedan idle behind a stack of pallets. One run. The first truck back to a loading bay, where men in rain slickers moved like efficient shadows. 2 guards left, one on the dock, one near the office, Lena said, counting truths. Marco said, "We take the dock." He palmed the crucifix and remembered Eddie laughing at gulls that stole fries. "This is for interest," he whispered, and his voice did not shake. They slid along a wall that leaked history and salt. The dock guard turned at a sound that Lena invented with a tossed bolt. Marco stepped in, low and certain, and sent the man to a nap he would later regret. They pried open a crate and saw false-bottom craftsmanship that made accountants proud. Beneath, bricks waited like patient sins. "We have our choir," Lena said, eyes hard and bright. Sirens began to audition in the distance. The lot exploded into angles when Detective Harris arrived late and ready. Agents spilled from vans with paperwork and purpose. "Hands where I can admire them," Harris said, but his admiration pointed at Marco first. Lena kept her gaze on the crate, like it might testify on its own. Vincent walked from a shadowed car that had been waiting for applause. "Officer, arrest the thief," Vincent said, and the word did cartwheels toward Marco. Harris raised an eyebrow that cashed a check. "Funny thing," Harris said. "This thief brought me your church ledger." Vincent's smile flickered, then found another outlet. "Documentation is theatrical," he said. Marco said, "Truth sells more seats." The agents lifted bricks that did not argue, and cameras without badges began to appear. Harris leaned close enough for regret. "You gave me a ladder," he said. "Pray I don't move it." Marco said, "Climb fast," and the rain applauded without mercy. Rain hammered the warehouse roof like a jury that had heard enough. Marco stood at the threshold and felt the night measure him for consequences. Lena adjusted her collar and watched the yard for patterns that lied less. "Harris is late," she said, and the words tasted like rust. Marco said, "Late is a kind of answer," and palmed the crucifix until it printed faith on skin. A side door opened, and Vincent Marino entered with 2 capos, who breathed boredom. "You brought daylight to a night sport," Vincent said, voice smooth as lacquer. Marco said, "I brought proof and a mirror." The capos spread like bookends waiting for a story to close. Lena's eyes flicked to the rafters and found a red camera light that should not exist. "We are recorded," she whispered, and Vincent smiled as if she had complimented the decor. "Then speak clearly," he said, and the rain applauded the invitation. Marco stepped forward and chose the words that could not be unsaid. Inside, the warehouse smelled like rope, diesel, and decisions. Vincent walked the center aisle as if blessing pews of contraband. "You want justice, I offer jurisdiction," he said, opening a velvet palm. Marco kept his voice low, because rage wastes air. "You ordered Eddie," he said, and the name steadied his breathing. Vincent's smile thinned to wire. "I ordered survival," he said, and the rain found a leak to underline it. Lena moved to the flank and counted exits without moving her head. "You can sit at my table," Vincent said. "You can run Pier 9 and keep the choir on pitch." Marco stared at the ledger in his pocket and heard Eddie laugh in the wrong tense. "My loyalty is not a leash anymore," he said, and the sentence surprised him with relief. The capos shifted like furniture anticipating a move. Vincent lifted his chin and waited for a pledge that would not arrive. The warehouse lights flickered like a tired conscience. Detective Harris arrived like weather that had changed its mind. He stepped from the shadows with a pistol that wanted promotion. "Everyone freeze," he said, but the command felt rented. Vincent chuckled and spread his hands as if revealing clean sleeves. "Officer, collect the stray," he said, nodding toward Marco like a tax bill. Lena watched Harris with eyes that refused to blink first. "Pick a side you can sleep on," she said, and the syllables cut careful. Harris's jaw worked through years of bad appetites. "I pick survival," he said, and the word bent in the air. The gun drifted toward Vincent and then toward Marco, and then toward a future with fewer witnesses. Something broke before the choice did. A shot cracked, loud enough to flatten hope. Marco felt the crucifix jump and smelled warm copper climb the rain. He looked down and saw blood that knew his name, and the roof kept hammering like an oath. The night split into sirens and footsteps, and choices ran in every direction. Vincent vanished through a side door that knew his weight. Harris lowered the gun and stared at his hands like they had lied. Lena gripped Marco's arm and felt the heat that argued with denial. "You're hit," she said, and the world narrowed to the radius of her voice. Marco tasted iron and memory and laughed once because he was still standing. "I'm not finished," he said, and the words held. They moved through a maze of crates while the rain rehearsed the eulogy above. Somewhere behind, men shouted about evidence and blame. Ahead, the river called like a witness who wanted a different story. Marco pressed the crucifix to the wound and let its cold insist on mourning. "You walk, I drive," Lena said, and the plan respected physics. They reached the loading door and met the wind that smelled like an ending. Dawn found the pier and painted it the color of mercy with conditions. Marco walked alone while gulls wrote their rude hymns. The crucifix hung heavy and wore a rust that was not rust. He watched the water take back pieces of the night and keep the rest. Harris's siren faded into a paperwork future. Lena's car idled in a distance that meant faith with boundaries. Marco said, "Eddie, I kept you out of the footnotes," and the air agreed. He lifted the crucifix and saw two men inside the metal, one who knelt and one who stood. "In this city, the only oath that matters is the one you take with yourself," he said, and the line belonged to the river now. Somewhere behind, Vincent was already writing a new gospel with old ink. Marco tucked the cross into his coat and turned toward a morning that would not forgive but might permit. The fog folded around him like a curtain that knew the cue.